Hi everyone, this week we are going to focus on program design and technique for plyometric training. Specifically, we're going to focus on, first of all, defining what plyometric training is, what a plyometric is, and then discussing why we would train for plyometrics. Then we're going to move into the two proposed mechanisms and physiological underpinning of plyometric training. This is the mechanical model and the stretch reflex. Then we'll move into the design of the plyometric training program, the specific variables associated with that. We'll talk about age considerations and safety considerations. So now let's look at this picture. We have a whole bunch of different sports. We have team-based sports like football. We have individual sports, wrestling, triple jump or long jump. We have powerlifting and throwing sports like javelin. So what are the commonalities across these different sports? Well, really, you should see that they produce a high amount of muscle force very quickly. And that's the definition of power. It's high force production over a short period of time. So on these pictures dictate or showcase various different sports. Some of them are single effort based sports like javelin or any throwing sport, powerlifting, running long jump or triple jump. It's a single effort where you have to produce max force to get to the desired whatever outcome that you would like. As well, we see on here that there's some sports that have multiple repeated max efforts, such as wrestling or football, where you have a max force and it could be repeated multiple times. So for example, in wrestling, where you're pushing an individual multiple times in a row with maximal force. So today, we will explore how to use training to attempt to enhance power production, so the maximum force that you can produce in the shortest period of time through plyometric training. Let's begin by defining plyometrics. These are exercises involving repeated rapid stretching and contracting. So we have a stretch of the muscle followed by a shortening of the muscle, as by jumping and rebounding to increase muscle power. This refers to any activity that enables a muscle to reach maximal force in the shortest possible time. So the first part of this definition is really important, that it's a repeated rapid stretching followed by a contraction. So we have an eccentric, a lengthening of the muscle, followed by a concentric. And we'll talk about on the forthcoming slides how important that first part is, the rapid stretching, the eccentric component, to generate the most force possible. Now let's further expand on our definition of plyometrics. These are quick, powerful movements using a pre-stretch or counter movement that involves the stretch-shortening cycle. We'll talk about that more on the next slide. Why do we need this pre-stretch? Well, the purpose is really to increase the power of the subsequent movement by using both the natural elastic components of muscle and tendon and the stretch reflex. So just think when you're doing a vertical jump, so stand up right now where you are and attempt a vertical jump. Do you keep your legs straight and jump from straight legs? The answer should be no. What do you do first? You bend your legs. You go into a squat almost, or a quarter squat, and then you jump as high as you can. Well, that quarter squat is really important because what you're doing is you're pre-stretching or eccentrically lengthening the quadricep muscle. And then that allows you to do your vertical jump higher. So right now, where you're standing, do a vertical jump with straight legs. You can hardly get off the ground, or I can't get off the ground. But when I do a quarter squat and then jump, I can go a lot higher. That's the idea here. We have to have a pre-stretch. The pre-stretch, or the eccentrically lengthening the muscle, allows for that stretch reflex to be activated and allows you to get a greater force production. Let's look at some of the pictures on the slides, which show plyometric exercises. The first one on the far left is a medicine ball throw, but the person is dropping the medicine ball into the person's hands while they're lying on the ground. So what's happening? Well, you have to catch the medicine ball first. So what's this doing? Well, it's eccentrically lengthening the muscles of the chest, so your pec muscles. And then what are you doing? Well, you have to throw the ball back up and generate as much force as possible. So now you're concentrically contracting your chest muscles. So it's a pre-stretch, eccentrically loading your chest muscles, and then it's followed by the concentric contraction. Now, if you just tried to throw the medicine ball from a concentric position, you wouldn't get it very far. You need the pre-stretch in order to activate the stretch reflex in order to generate the most force possible in the shortest amount of time. Likewise, if we look at the far right picture of the split squat jump, the individual first bends down to the ground and then jumps and switches legs. So that's the eccentric. You're lengthening the quadricep muscle with the deep bend, and then you're concentrically contracting the quadricep muscle. So you have to have the pre-stretch. You have to bend your leg in order to generate the most force in order to switch your legs for the split squat jump. Try it yourself. Remember, you always have to bend your leg in order to jump the highest. This is called the pre-stretch, okay, the counter movement, in order to activate and involve the stretch shortening cycle. Most people don't even think about this pre-stretch. You just inherently do it. You automatically will bend before or eccentrically load or lengthen that muscle before you're going to contract it, especially when you have to generate a high amount of force. And so it's inherent to common movement behavior. It's just now we're making you aware of the fact that you actually have to activate the pre-stretch to get the maximum amount of force. We'll talk about the timing of that pre-stretch. You need to do it quite quickly. The faster you do it, the faster the transferability of that force into movement. Now let's discuss why plyometrics. Well, many functional movements and athletic success depends on both the proper function of all active muscles and the speed at which these muscle forces are used. So when used correctly, plyometric training has consistently been shown to improve the production of muscle force and power. This is over a chronic training period. So don't expect these huge advancements within a week. This is multiple weeks in a periodized plan to generate this force with chronic stimulus of plyometric training to drive the neuromuscular change. So the power term used to define this is called the force-speed relationship. You're generating high amounts of force in a short amount of time. There's two proposed models that account for this from a physiological standpoint. One is a mechanical model, and the other one is the neurophysiological model, involving more of the nervous system. The goal here is that we want to increase the production of power in the shortest amount of time. Let's now discuss the first model proposed to account for plyometric mechanics and physiology. This is known as the mechanical model of plyometric exercise, where elastic energy in the musculotendinous components, also known as the series elastic components or SEC, series elastic components, is increased with a rapid stretch or eccentric load, and then that energy is stored within the muscle. And if a concentric muscle action immediately follows, the stored energy is released, which allows for an increase in the total force production. So in this model, the mechanical model, the pre-stretch is really important. So the pre-stretch, that rapid stretch, generates energy in the series elastic components of the musculotendinous components. And that elastic energy, if it's followed by concentric contraction, is released automatically into that concentric contraction, increasing the total force produced by the muscle. So with that, if you do not have a pre-stretch, you will not have this elastic energy generated in the muscle and used to increase muscle force production. Hence the reason why you try to just jump with straight legs, you don't get very high. You actually need the pre-stretch. You need this elastic energy to drive a large force production. Now let's look at this mechanical model a little bit more in depth. There's three components here. The first one is the SEC, known as the series elastic component. And when this is stretched, it stores elastic energy that increases the force production of the concentric contraction. The second component is the serial elastic component, or the PEC. And this is like the glad wrap that I say that, or the cling wrap that surrounds the muscle. So this is the epimysium, the perimysium, the endomysium, and the sarcolemma, or the muscle cell membrane. And this exerts a passive force when with unstimulated muscle stretch. So these two, the SEC and the PEC, produce elastic energy, which if the concentric or the eccentric contraction is followed by the concentric contraction, it allows for an increase in muscle force production. The third component is the contractile component of the muscle, which is the actin, the myosin, and the cross bridges. And this is the primary source of muscle force during the concentric muscle action. So we have the sec and the pec generating elastic energy with a pre-stretch, which then allows for greater muscle contraction, muscle force production, with the contractile components being concentrically contracted. This is known as the stretch-shortening cycle. So the stretch reflex is utilized frequently during sport because most movements involve the two phases of muscle contraction. An eccentric phase, which is the muscle lengthening under tension, is followed by a concentric phase in which the muscle is shortened. Attaining a pre-stretch of the muscle causes it to be lengthened eccentrically, so tension is developed in the muscle, similar to the stretching of a rubber band. So if you're at home right now, you can stretch a rubber band. When you stretch it, there's lots of tension there, okay? And when you let it go, there's a high amount of force production. So this stored energy created by the tension can be used to help increase the strength of the following concentric contraction. This concentric contraction must immediately follow being stretched, or the tension created will dissipate as heat. So if you don't do a pre-stretch and then jump right away, you'll lose that elastic energy as heat. So you have to, it's very important, the speed of the eccentric contraction must be followed by a rapid concentric contraction. An example is a quick counter movement jump before actually doing a vertical jump, which allows the quadricep to be stretched eccentrically so that the following concentric contraction can be stronger. The amount of tension created by stretching the muscle is dependent on the degree and the speed of the muscle's pre-stretch. Exploiting the elasticity of the muscle and the stretch reflex is referred to as using the stretch-shortening cycle. It has been shown that the faster the muscle is stretched eccentrically, the greater the force will be on the following concentric contraction. So the speed at which you eccentrically load and then concentrically contract is very important to maximize force production. Hence the reason why when you train for plyometrics, you need to do them quick and you need to make sure your neuromuscular system is very fresh. Now let's discuss the second proposed mechanism underpinning plyometric training, and this is the neurophysiological model of plyometric exercise. And this involves potentiation of the eccentric muscle action by use of the stretch reflex. So potentiation, remember, is the change in the force velocity characteristics of the muscle's contractile components caused by a stretch. Okay, the key here is that you need a stretch to cause a reflex. And this is based on potentiation in the neuromuscular system or the nervous system. Okay, so the stretch reflex is the body's involuntary response to an external stimuli that stretches the muscle. The amount of tension generated by stretching the muscle is dependent on the degree and the speed of the muscle's pre-stretch. So let's look at this in a little bit more detail on the next slide. All right, so let's look at the stretch reflex in a little bit more detail. On the left side, we see the muscle belly, and the green lines are the nerve fibers that synapse at the spinal cord. So let's look at the first component to this. When the muscle spindles are stimulated, which could be from a passive stretch, the stretch reflex is stimulated, sending input to the spinal cord or the central nervous system via the type 1A nerve fibers. So they synapse the dorsal root with the ventral root, and after synapsing with the alpha motor neurons in the spinal cord, impulses then travel to the agonist extrafusal fibers, causing a reflexive muscle action. So this is similar to when you touch something hot and then you have the reflex of taking your finger off. But this is the reflex as a result of a stretch. So when you're doing plyometrics and you're all of a sudden bending your legs, you're stretching the muscle, which stimulates the muscle spindles and causes this process to occur, causes the reflex, which is the jump. So ultimately, we have these two proposed models. We have the mechanical model, where we have the sec and the pec creating elastic energy, which is used if it's followed by a concentric contraction to increase muscle force. And we also have the neurophysiological model, which is more about the stretch reflex. Ultimately, I think it's a combination of the two models that create the maximum force that we see as a result of a pre-stretch. The key here is in both models, you require a pre-stretch. And the degree in which you generate max force is dependent on the degree and the speed of the muscle's pre-stretch. So it's been shown that the faster the muscle is stretched eccentrically, the greater the force will be on the following concentric contraction. So ultimately, it comes down to the combination of the mechanical and the neurophysiological models to understand plyometrics. And this is called, the combination of the two is called the stretch-shortening cycle. So we need a stretch, which is the eccentric loading of the muscle, followed by a shortening, which is the concentric. So for plyometric training, you need an eccentric component and the subsequent concentric component. So the stretch-shortening cycle employs both the energy storage of the series elastic components, the SEC, and the stimulation of the stretch reflex to facilitate maximal increase in muscle recruitment over a minimal amount of time. Okay, so that's very important that the pre-stretch is key in order to maximize force production in a short period of time. Also, a fast rate of musculotendinous stretch is vital to muscle recruitment and activity resulting from the stretch shortening cycle. So this is very, very important. The rate at which you eccentrically load the muscle, the speed at which you pre-stretch is vital. Okay, followed by the speed of the concentric contraction. Otherwise, that potential energy or elastic energy is lost as heat. So it's very important to have a very fast stretch, and therefore, the subsequent concentric contraction. This physiology underpins how you're going to prescribe exercise and train a client. You need to make sure that, one, they're fresh, and number two, they're going to be pre-stretching really quickly. So this means that you need to maximize this overload of the pre-stretch in order to get the adaptation that you're desiring. Now let's move into an example of this, and this would be the running long jump. And on your PowerPoint slides, you'll see two different slides. One will not have the green 2 points, while the first one will have the picture of the running long jump. So we're going to talk about this, where that foot comes down and touches just before that white line so that you can explode in the air for your long jump. There's 3 phases of this stretch shortening cycle. The first one, as we've talked about, is the pre-stretch, where it's the eccentric phase. So the action is the stretch of the agonist muscle, and the physiological event is elastic energy is stored in the series elastic component, and the muscle spindles are stimulated from the stretch. The second phase is amortization, and this is a momentary pause between phases 1 and 3. The type 1A afferent nerves synapse with alpha motor neurons. The alpha motor neurons transmit the signal to the agonist muscle group. The third phase is the concentric contraction, which is the shortening of the agonist muscle fibers, where we have the elastic energy is released from the series elastic component. The alpha motor neurons stimulate the agonist muscle group. So in 1966, Yuri Yershevsky, a Soviet jumping coach, observed that jumpers with the shortest amount of ground contact time, which is the amortization phase, displayed the greatest jumping performance. So improvements can be made in jumping performance by increasing the amount of tension the athlete can generate during the eccentric contraction, and by improving the reactive ability of muscles in switching from the eccentric to the concentric phase. So ultimately, you want to increase eccentric tension, so the eccentric strength of the athlete is very important. And second of all is increasing the reactive ability to decrease that momentary pause between the 2 phases, to decrease the amortization phase. So those 2 pieces are the goals of plyometric training. Increase eccentric tension through eccentric strengthening, and 2, increase reactive ability to decrease the momentary pause between the 2 phases known as the amortization phase. So the reduction in the time of the amortization phase means greater force produced, less elastic energy lost as heat production. This is extremely important and is the focus for plyometric training. So here's another example, again showcasing the long jump and the stretch shortening cycle. So at touchdown, we have the eccentric loading of the agonist muscle So this begins at touchdown and continues until the movement ends. That's the eccentric. The next is the B, which is amortization, which is that momentary pause between the eccentric and concentric. So it's a transition from eccentric to concentric phases. It is quick and without movement. So you want to really minimize that amortization phase to maximize the force of the concentric contraction. C is that the concentric contraction, which composes the entire push-off time until the athlete's foot leaves the surface. So you can think of this stretch shortening cycle for any type of plyometric. When you're doing hops or bounds or one vertical jump, you want to minimize the ground contact time if you're doing some sort of eccentric load. So this pre-stretch needs to be very short. The time that you bend your knees for a vertical jump and hold it at the bottom, you don't want to hold it at the bottom. It's a pre-stretch and then immediately jump into the concentric contraction. Okay, so let's go over our two main points so far. The stretch shortening cycle combines mechanical and neurophysiological mechanisms and is the basis of plyometric exercise. Number two, a rapid eccentric pre-stretch muscle action stimulates the stretch reflex and storage of elastic energy, which increases the force produced during the subsequent concentric action. The stretch is needed. Remember that. The faster the muscle is stretched eccentrically, the greater the force will be on the following concentric contraction. Now let's move into the design of plyometric training programs. So to begin, let's go back to the steps in designing any type of training program. We're putting emphasis here on plyometric training, but the steps involved are the same across any program design. First, you have to understand the physical demands or the physiological demands of the sport, of the occupation, of your client. So this is your demands and needs analysis and what the adaptations are that you're trying to acquire. Then you meet with your client. In this case, I'm talking about an athlete for most of this because plyometrics is primarily prescribed for an athlete population, that special population of athletes. So you meet with your athlete, you do a history, you go over their goal setting, you classify their training age, their resistance training status, all of that information. Then once you see, you have to ask the questions, first of all, whether there is a power component to the sport or occupation or their lifestyle. And if yes, then you must incorporate plyometrics into the program. The question then becomes, what is the priority of explosive power to this individual? And if it's not that high of a priority, then you don't place a priority in the training program prescription. The second question you ask is, what is the goal of the athlete? Do they need to improve their power production? You can get athlete feedback. You can ask the coach their feedback on the physiological components of that athlete. You can also do a physical assessment feedback based on a gap analysis to see if the individual is not quite where they should be for that age and gender and for that sport, or they might be well above where they need to be. And it's more about maintaining that and using it as their card that sets them apart from other athletes. The third component is you always do that gap analysis, where you do tests of power to determine whether the athlete needs to focus on this portion in their program, or it could be just to maintain the already power that they have. So how much power do they need for that specific sport? And that's where you would do a gap analysis and compare to normative standards of age and gender in that specific sport. So that's really important, the physiological assessment and the gap analysis. And that information really drives and provides the priority of plyometrics for program design. So coming back to the steps in designing a plyo training program, the first, as I just mentioned, is that needs and demand analysis of the sport or of the occupation. What are the physical abilities needed to be successful in the sport, the lifestyle, the occupation? Is power a key performance factor? If it's not, then you don't include plyos. If it is, then you determine the priority of plyometrics to that sport or the demands, and then you prioritize it in your program design. Second of all, you meet with your client. Is power a key performance factor they want to improve? Get the coach feedback too. You want to classify their training status. Also determine their experience with plyos and you classify their plyo training status, which we'll talk about in subsequent slides. Talk about previous injuries, current injuries, positional demands. Knowing this information, you can create and design a safe, effective plyometric training program. Remember, the goals of program design are the same. Prevent injuries or minimize injuries by targeting and strengthening areas of injury. Second of all is increase system tolerance and capacity and improve relative performance for that individual. The third and fourth step are the assessments. So you do your physiological testing and your gap analysis. So assess power using multiple valid and reliable tests to determine their power abilities. You want to pick tests that are specific to that individual's needs and demands placed on them, or sports specificity, as well as you want to compare their results to normative standards and classify them and do your gap analysis. The fifth component is you set goals for the training program. So consider the client's goals, the coach feedback, your test results, your gap analysis, and the sport demands. And you refine your initial goals that the client expressed to you based on their physical assessment and their gaps. So the first component that you want to consider in the design of a plyometric training program is the mode of plyometrics. Are you prescribing lower body plyometrics and or upper body plyometrics? And this comes back to the demands and needs of your athlete or your client. So lower body plyometrics are appropriate for virtually any athlete in any sport. Many sports require athletes to produce maximum vertical or lateral movements in a short amount of time. There's a wide variety of lower body drills with various intensity levels and directional movements. There's a huge amount of referenced exercises that you can look at in the NSCA Strength and Conditioning textbook in the page range of 484 to 518. Ultimately, you want to pick the most sports-specific plyometrics to assign to your client in order to increase the transferability to performance. This table showcases lower body plyometric drills. There are essentially 6 types of lower body plyo drills. All start with a stretch or pre-stretch, then followed by concentric contraction. You need to be familiar with all 6 of these and an example of them. The first one is jumps in place. The second one is standing jumps. Then we have multiple hops and bounds. Then we have bounds themselves, box jumps, and depth jumps. So let's talk about jumps in place. These drills involve jumping and landing in the same spot. So jumps in place emphasize the vertical component of jumping and are performed repeatedly without rest between jumps. The time between jumps is the stretch-shortening cycle's amortization phase. Examples of jumps in place includes squat jumps and tuck jumps, where they're repeated. You hit the ground again, and you're jumping. The next is standing jumps, and these emphasize either horizontal or vertical components. So this is a little different than jumps in place because jumps in place is only vertical. Standing jumps have a horizontal or vertical component. So standing jumps are max efforts with recovery between reps. So this is the typical vertical jump or a standing long jump where it's one max effort. It's not repeated. Jumps in place is repeated. Multiple hops and jumps involve repeated movements and may be viewed as a combination of jumps in place and standing jumps. So one example of this is a zigzag hop where you can do over cones or over some sort of ladder, anything like this where you have a zigzag hop, which is multiple hops in a row or jumps. So they can have a vertical and or horizontal component. Then we have bounds, which are any type of bounding drills, involve exaggerated movements with greater horizontal speed than other drills, and you can read more about that in that description. Then we have box drills, where these drills increase the intensity of multiple hops and jumps by using a box. So the box may be used to jump on or off of. The height of the box depends on the size of the athlete, the landing surface, and the goals of the program. Box jumps may involve one, both, or alternating legs. And then the depth jumps use gravity and the athlete's weight to increase the exercise intensity. So these are more for advanced individuals who are classified as advanced for plyometric training. So the athlete assumes a position on a box and they step off or land and immediately jumps vertically, horizontally, or to another box. So these are the most high intensity type of plyometric there is. So you need to be familiar with this table and examples of all these different types of drills. Now let's refresh our memory of the goals of a training plan. So what are the 3 general training goals? Well, first of all is strengthening common injury sites. And in this case, it's musculotendinous sites, especially for plyometric training. The second is build efficiency and capacity. So developing the ability to store more elastic energy and faster transmission of motor units and stretch reflex. Okay, and the third is really the transferability to improve performance. Those are the main 3 general training goals of plyometric training. The specific training goals is to enhance the speed and strength of the eccentric stretch. That's really important. And number 2 is minimize that amortization phase. So working on reactive ability. So the first specific goal is eccentric strength. The second one is developing reactive ability to minimize the time of the amortization phase. Let's look at some examples. Let's first of all look at the top left, which is a 2-foot ankle hop. So you can practice this if you stand up from your desk and you just hop up in the air. And this could be repeated many, many times. So you jump, you jump, you jump, you jump, you jump. You might do 5 or 6 repeats of this in a row to try to get the highest vertical component. This would be an example of a jump in place where you have vertical repeated 2-foot ankle hops. You can also have single leg ankle hops, which is the one on the right, top right, where you're using a single leg and you're hopping, hop, 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 right? So each of those have a pre-stretch followed by the concentric. There's the tuck jump, or also known as a squat jump, which is the bottom left. If you do it multiple times in a row, it's a jump in place with a vertical repeated component of jumps. Or if you do just one jump, one max jump in a tuck jump or a max squat jump, this would be an example of a standing jump. So it's a single max effort, only utilizing the vertical component. The last one, the jump and reach, where your partner is standing on a box with something that you need to jump and reach to. Okay, the person that's actually doing the jump, they do the pre-stretch. We can see it on the left picture. The guy's doing his pre-stretch, and then he's jumping as high as he can with a max effort to try to touch that. That would be either a jump in place if there's a vertical repeated jumps, or a standing jump where you have a single max effort, only utilizing the vertical component. In your lecture slides for this week, I put a ton of examples of different types of lower body and upper body plyometrics that you can refer to. You should be familiar with the different types and examples of each. So the second mode is upper body plyometrics. And the question you need to ask yourself is, does the athlete need to be powerful in the upper body? For example, are they pushing a person with all their strength? Do they have to produce a max force very quickly in their upper body? And if so, whether it be a single max effort or repeated max efforts, you need to include some sort of plyometric, upper body plyometric mode within your program design. Remember, the stretch is key even for the upper body, so the speed of the stretch and the concentric contraction is very important. So the mode is dependent on the demands of the activity. You can do medicine ball throws, catches, several types of push-ups, repeat efforts, or a single max power effort. So it depends on the specificity that you're trying to replicate based on the sport demands. But remember, the pre-stretch needs to be fast, and the degree of that pre-stretch will dictate how much force you can actually produce. Again, I provided some examples of different upper body plyometric modalities within your lecture slides that you can refer to. Make note that each of them start with the pre-stretch. A classic example of an upper body plyometric drill is the typical chest pass with a medicine ball. So the medicine ball is weighted, could be relatively lightweight, 1 kilo to up to 5 kilos, possibly even more. But the key here with plyometrics is you want to move the ball as fast as possible. It's not about how heavy the ball is. You want to be able to produce max force. Okay, so when you're working with the first time with a client, you don't need a heavy medicine ball. Focus on the speed at which they're pushing the ball, the speed of the pre-stretch, minimizing the amortization period, and then doing the concentric as fast as possible. As you can see in this example, when you catch the ball, your hands are out, and this allows for the eccentric, where you're lengthening the chest muscles, followed by the amortization phase, which you want to minimize, and then you're doing the concentric contraction, where you're contracting the agonist muscles, which in this case would be the chest muscles. The last plyometric modality is that for the trunk or the core. So you can almost make any core-based exercise, focusing on your abs and your posterior chain, to be plyometric. And this is making modifications to the movement. Specifically, the exercise movement must be shorter and quicker to allow stimulation and use of the stretch reflex. So you're not just doing slow movements, you're catching that medicine ball for this trunk-based movement, and you're doing it as fast as possible. So the pre-stretch is fast, the concentric phase is fast. So everything has to be done fast. In order to be fast, you have to train fast, and you have to train that neuromuscular, neurophysiological, the mechanical stretch reflex in order to get fast.